I love a good sequence. Synth sequences, box sequences, Fibonacci sequences. And lucky for me, a lot of electronic music relies really heavily on sequencing. But just like anything that is used a lot, it can kind of quickly become stagnant and predictable and a little... So today, we'll just take a few minutes to talk about some ways that I've found over the years to make my own sequences a little less predictable and maybe a little more interesting, at least. That's the hope. I think the most important question we can ask before we start to create a sequence is, how does this sequence function? And I'm not talking about a music theory-based analysis of the sequence at all. Instead, just asking the simple question, what is the purpose of this sequence? Why am I using a sequence here? What role does it play? Can kind of influence all of the decisions that you make after that question. Is the sequence like the main element of the track? Is it the main focal point? Is it almost a substitute for a melodic idea? Or is it kind of textural or tucked away in the background of the track, or something that is meant to accompany something else? Could be a rhythmic element like an ostinato. Essentially, if we can determine whether our sequence is the leader or a follower in our track, then we can make more informed, specific decisions. If the sequence happens to be the main focal point of the track, serving almost like a melodic idea, these are the common problems that I've run into in those kinds of sequences in my own music. They're often too predictable, they have no sense of direction, and they get monotonous and kind of boring pretty quickly. If you recall, we've talked about melodic writing on this channel, and some of those same issues can arise in melodies as well. They get a little cliche. So, stands to reason we could probably apply some of the same concepts to our sequences. Just like a melody, the shape of the sequence I think is probably the most important thing, and we can go in and figure out the specific notes later, but first, just establishing what's the overall arc of this phrase, if you think of it like a phrase. Will it start low and kind of gradually ascend as we progress throughout the sequence? Will it sort of arc somewhere in the middle and have the climax, 3/4 of the way through? What if we include a large leap in there somewhere for like an accent or for emphasis, just like we would in melodic writing? Once we have the overall shape of our sequence down, a common issue that arises is also kind of a common problem in melodic writing, centering the melody or centering the sequence around one or two pitches, one or two notes. This happens when we repeat the same pitch too many times or have one or two notes that kind of the sequence kind of always seems to come back to. And it starts to have this circular feeling, like we can't escape this gravitational pull of these one or two notes. And there might be a time, later in the video, where that's exactly what we want to happen. But if we're thinking about more of a linear progression, that can kind of kill any momentum that we might have and get us stuck in this loop. And this opens up the whole Pandora's box of predictability versus inevitability, which I'm usually striving for the latter. I don't want my music to seem too predictable, like you could see it coming, but I want it to feel like that's what was supposed to happen, because I've tried several things and figured out the best option. I won't get too deep into that philosophy today, but if you're interested in reading more about that, I do have a free ebook on my favorite compositional concepts that have helped me the most in my own music throughout the years. That's going to be the first link in the description, and it's a free download for you if you want it. Another way I like to break up the predictability of my sequences is simply by using odd lengths. Because most step sequencers are set up in rows of 8 or groups of 16, it's very easy to get stuck, sort of going round and round in that particular grouping. So I like sequences that go across the bar line slightly, or fall just short of the bar line. And I've talked about this in my ARP video as well, if you want to check that one out, about arpeggios, how if you get the harmonic aspect right, you can do some interesting things and have some ever-evolving patterns just by layering sequences of different lengths. But we'll talk about layering sequences later in the video as well. One thing I learned from all those years of playing Prokofiev is that I love melodic ideas that go across the bar line. But still feel natural, and that's kind of what I want to achieve with my sequences as well. I don't want you to be able to exactly know where the bar line is, but if there can be something that kind of bridges that gap and doesn't feel quite so repetitive, that can make a sequence feel much less predictable and cliche. If you're a rock fan, I think the band Rush is really good at this, doing things in odd time signatures, but they don't necessarily feel like they're in odd time signatures because there's always a melodic through line or a riff that goes across the bar and kind of glues everything together. If your sequences are not the main thing in your track, then we need to take a slightly different approach and oftentimes do the exact opposite of everything I just described. One of my favorite things to do, and the way a lot of my music has come about, is to set up a synth sequence and then improvise underneath that sequence. And if I'm going to explore, more harmonies or more interesting chord progressions underneath a sequence, that sequence cannot contain too much harmonic information. Otherwise, it's going to lock me in to a certain key, a certain mode, a certain set of chords that maybe I want to break out of and explore other key areas. So I still think the shape of the sequence is an important concept, like that is what gives it character and makes it interesting, but including too much harmonic information is a little bit arresting if you're trying to do interesting things around it harmonically. So in this case, I think of sequences as implying harmony rather than dictating the harmony. And that makes almost no sense, but here's what I mean by that. If we're in a certain key or a certain mode, we know that we have set values for each scale degree. Maybe the easiest example of this is in a major key, we have a major third. The third scale degree is raised. And in a minor key, it's lowered a half step to a minor third. Unless I want to lock myself into either major or minor, maybe have a tasty dissonance in there somewhere that kind of rubs up against some other harmonies that I play underneath, I might conscientiously avoid the third altogether so that I don't declare whether I'm in a major key or a minor key. Composers have been using this sort of technique as a tool to create ambiguity for a long time. And this keeps more of my options open as I accompany myself or accompany my synth with the Rhodes or the piano or whatever I happen to be playing. And when you combine that with another concept we talked about earlier of creating patterns of odd lengths. Let's say we have a pattern of 5 and layered with a pattern of 8. Suddenly, what were two kind of harmonically ambiguous sequences can line up in interesting ways vertically to create something that you didn't expect and can be really inspiring, but should still work and be flexible because you haven't dictated what the harmony will be with your sequence. I do want to mention that the key takeaway from any of these videos that are more instructional are not to tell you what to do, but just to kind of give you maybe a new way of looking at things based on my experience, because that's the only thing that I can really talk about with any authority. But I think maybe the most important thing I can convey to you is don't spend so much time looking for the perfect formula or planning or trying to figure out the right way to do things that you never actually start experimenting on your own. A lot of this is trial and error. And I think you'll learn a lot more by taking a couple concepts that make you think differently and experimenting with them on your own than you will from endless tutorials here on YouTube. So with that said, get out of here and go make some sequences of your very own.